Welcome to Cast Live. My name is Sarah Guerrero. I am a senior at the Advanced Learning Academy. Today I'll be your moderator. Please let us know that you're here by typing in your name and school in the chat. So Cast Live is our virtual gathering place to listen to stories of hope and resilience during these pandemic times. It is also a place for Cast students and educators to ask and learn from our guests. Recently, students were polled on what they would like to hear about, and mental health was the #1 topic. We are grateful to welcome Dr. Margaret Mauzé. Margaret R. Mauzé, PhD, is a board-certified pediatric psychologist. She graduated from Georgetown University as an undergraduate, where she double majored in English and psychology. She received her PhD in clinical child and adolescent psychology from the University of Kansas in 2005. In 2008, she received specialty board certification in clinical child and adolescent psychology, the youngest psychologist in the country at the time to do so. She spent 8 years as a staff psychologist at the Cleveland Clinic Child's Hospital, where she was also the director of pediatric psychology postdoctoral fellowship program. She moved to Texas in 2012, where she opened her own private practice. She currently serves as a consultant at the Acorn, a school for young children. She has over 25 professional publications, including a collaboration on a children's book about anxiety, William the What If Wonder on His First Day of School, which was featured on Showcase with Barbara Keller in 2019. Her most important role is as a mom to her 2 young boys. Dr. Mauzé, welcome to Cast Live.
Thank you, Sarah. That was lovely. It's very fun to be here with all of you. There are lots of you. Wow.
So today is about you, Cast students and educators. Dr. Mauzé is here to answer your questions. Please type them in the chat. If selected, I will call your name. Please be prepared to have your camera on and ask your question live. So to start, I will ask the first question. Can you share your personal story of hope and resilience? How are you personally handling change caused by COVID-19?
Oh, that is a good question. So I guess let me give you a little background on sort of what our situation is here in our house, because I know, we all have a lot on our plates at this point. So pre-COVID-19, obviously I was out going to school and consulting with the schools that I work with and supporting families and educators who needed assistance with kind of day-to-day things that come up. And then when this all started, obviously I'm now home. My husband is also home, and our 2 children, who are 4 and 6, are also home. And we finished school an hour and a half ago. So that is one thing off of our plates, which is lovely. But I think the challenge with where we are right now is that it's constantly evolving, right? So when this began, what now seems like ages ago, nobody expected, or at least nobody I know expected, that we were still going to be in this position 9, 10, 11 weeks later. It started off as this, oh, okay, we'll take a week and kind of reevaluate. And then that week turned into 2 and then 4 and so on and so forth. And so I think the advantage of that for us as a family is we didn't know how far ahead this was going to be. And I think if somebody said to me, this is the moment that we're going to blow the whistle and life will return as normal, and gave me a date, it might really throw me off to picture how long that might be. But I think what we have figured out is that every day is a different day. So there are some days that are great and everything just clicks into place. And there are some days that it is a goal that we all get out of bed, before a reasonable time, and people eat food and we still like each other by the time we go to bed. And some days that's easier than others, if we're all being honest. I figured out pretty quickly for me, because I was taking on the role of psychologist to anybody who needed assistance, plus mom plus kindergarten teacher, which is not my gift, as it turns out, plus all of the other just normal day-to-day home things, I figured out pretty early on that for me to function well, from an emotional perspective, there were certain things I have to have in place every single day. So I get up still at the same time that I would get up if we were not in the middle of a pandemic. If I don't do that, I get out of bed feeling like I'm behind the 8 ball all day long and I can't catch up. So I get up at the same time. I take a shower every day. For you all, I used my blow dryer this morning. So, that was a win. But, there are certain things I have to do every day. I have to exercise. That's always been my way of coping. And I have to be outside every day. Those are really the 4 things I have to have. So shower, out of bed at my normal time, exercise, and outside. Everything else could be hit or miss. But if I hit those 4 things, I personally cope better, which makes it easier for me to cope or to help everybody else in my family cope. But I think it's really become a question of taking each day as it comes and kind of we'll see where today is. I have also figured out that if I stay off of the news and social media, it makes an enormous difference in my anxiety level. So I think that's kind of where we are at our house. But it's been interesting for all of us. So.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to have a question from Miss Jean Russell. I invite you to ask your question.
So I think you touched upon the fact that tempers can be frayed and we're in very close quarters. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like acts of forgiveness and giving others grace when you're in tight quarters.
Yes, that is a great question. And I think not just grace for those of us in tight quarters, but grace for everybody, the person in front of you at the grocery store and the person behind you at the grocery store. It is very interesting. We, much as you love your family or, whatever your situation is with your family or your roommates, whatever your situation is, even under the best of circumstances, people wear on our nerves. That's just part of being human. And when we're all in such close proximity at all times, it can get really high. What we have figured out at our house is that what benefits us is if we all have designated spaces that are our own, that we go to for specific periods of time during the day, during which we will not be disturbed. So for us, my kiddos are little, which makes it a little bit easier, but they have a designated quiet time in their rooms after lunch. And so we eat lunch and then I don't really care too much about what you do in your room as long as you stay there and you just, take an hour and kind of reset. For me and my husband, what has happened or what we have figured out as we've gone is the more we can communicate with each other about where we are emotionally in that particular day, the better we can accommodate the other person. So there are some days that we both get out of bed and it's, we just have to survive till the end of the day. There are other days where it's more of a seesaw, where one of us is doing okay and the other one is struggling a little bit with how long will this go on and what is our economic situation going to be like when this is over, and how is that going to impact us. And so we've had to get very upfront about saying, I have to go right this minute and take a walk, or I need 2 hours this afternoon or this morning to go to be by myself. And whether that's closed off in a room, or my husband will take his stuff that he needs to do and go to a park and isolate himself in a corner of a park somewhere and try to get stuff done. And then I know that I'm on point for everything that's happening at home. But you also have to have that balance where, okay, great. Like if you took this morning, then I get this afternoon, like I have to go for a walk or I have to do whatever. Just trying to find those pockets of space that you can get a little space from each other and also reset yourself. So my husband is much better at mentally compartmentalizing things. I have a much harder time with that. I have all things on my plate at all times. And so like there's not a lot of wiggle room. So for me, I've had to get very intentional about, okay, like while I am going for my walk, or if I'm going to go sit in the backyard for 10 minutes, because that's what works for that day, then I'm sitting in the backyard for 10 minutes and I'm taking a whole lot of deep breaths. And I'm really focusing on the positive things of the day. That also has made a big difference with mood, is if we take the focus on, as difficult as this is, there is something good every day. And sometimes you really have to search for it. And sometimes the good might be, hey, I took my shower today and that was a win, like that might be it. Other days it might be, wow, like this was great. Like we all got along and, we did these amazing things. But if I can finish every day coming up with 2 or 3 things that I feel like were good about the day, I fall asleep in a better mentality, which means I sleep better. And then that helps with the next morning. And we're starting our kids on that too. Like, let's focus. What were some of your favorite things? And dinner time for us is a really good time to focus on those things. Like, what's happened so far today that we think was really good. And then once kids are down, my husband and I will do a decompress on, okay, well, what do you need? And where are you? And how do we make this happen? And just having that grace that if somebody snaps at you, you know what, like I probably snapped at you yesterday and I didn't mean it. And I'm just in a bad spot too. So a little bit of that, we're all doing the very best that we can in the situation that we're in. And some days our best is better than it is other days. Sometimes our best is mediocre. And that's reality for where we are right now. So.
Right. Well, now I invite Ms. Carol Mendenhall to ask her question.
What do you think are going to be the long-term effects for students who are struggling at this time?
Struggling academically or emotionally?
Academically, mentally?
All of it. Yeah.
Right.
This is a big point of discussion in the psychology groups that I'm in, and certainly on a national level, this is something that we're all worried about. So what we know about adolescents in general, right, is that this is a time where adolescents are supposed to be more independent. They're supposed to be starting to gravitate more towards friends and towards peers for advice and for their connection, and they start to break away from home a little bit more. And they tend to fight more with parents at that time. This is also a time that we see pre-pandemic increases in anxiety and depression because there's just so many biological changes that happen during adolescence. Put us in this situation that we're in now where teenagers are having to learn to a certain extent independently from home at a distance. Their social interaction is minimal or limited and different. And then all of the financial stress that the majority of families are facing at this point. And it is something that we worry about. What we know from past situations like the Spanish flu of 1918 and the Great Depression and things like that is that there are going to be people who emerge and who do just fine. The vast majority of people will turn out to be okay. At the same time, there are also those who are going to come out of this with higher levels of anxiety or higher levels of depression or higher levels of isolation. What's different about this situation than anything we've ever dealt with before is the whole 24-hour news cycle, which is difficult to turn off, and the social media piece of it. And the social media piece of it, in a way, is really helpful. Something like this for teenagers can be really great. You can Zoom with your friends, or you can FaceTime with your friends, or you can have that face-to-face interaction, which helps to offset some of those isolation issues. At the same time, you can also be looking at that and seeing, well, nobody is contacting me, or, oh, I'm not allowed out, but here's a whole group of people that I know, and they were all at a pool party last weekend or wherever, they were all hanging out in somebody's front yard and they didn't tell me and I wasn't there. And, so we expect that we're going to see higher levels of anxiety and depression, but part of what we're trying to put in place, particularly when we look at schools in the fall and not really knowing what that's going to look like, is what can we put in place to help offset the realities of the situation that we're in. So whether that's doing some small group social interaction virtually, whether that's trying to figure out how do we help for kids who have academic struggles or learning struggles, how do we help meet their needs and get them the additional assistance that they need. You know, that's something that we're still trying to figure out based on what next year is going to look like, and what our options are. But it's an enormous challenge. And for kids who are struggling, while the computer and distance learning is a great thing, you also have to have the motivation to sit down and to do it, or have somebody in your house who is going to really strongly encourage and assist you in that. And the reality is too, with parents that are both working from home, or one parent who is also working, it's hard to carve that out. So that's something that is being talked about at every level, even all the way up to, you know, local government, in terms of how can we help families, especially going into fall, if we have people who are still going to be at home, how is that remotely feasible for us to be able to meet everybody's needs, and how can we help with that? That's not a very, like, that doesn't tie it up in a bow, I'm sorry, but there's a lot that we're still figuring out as we go, which is hard.
Thank you for that answer. Now the next question is from Miss Lindsay Unsworth.
So you talked a little bit about the things that you need to have in your life every single day to make you happy. And also kind of going off of what you were just saying about having motivation and trying to accomplish things during the day, so it doesn't feel like the day slips away from us or that we're kind of stuck. What tips do you have for kind of maintaining that kind of personal schedule, or maybe ticking things off of a list that help us feel like we're actually accomplishing things?
That is a great question. Thank you. So yes, so I think it's a combination of having a schedule and having a routine, and giving yourself grace that a pandemic may or may not be the time to tackle every single thing on your to-do list, right? Like, I started this with such aspirations, like my list of home projects and all the things I was going to organize and sort through, and none of that has happened. So I think you have to start with what are the basics. So figuring out for you personally, what are the things that help you cope in a positive way? So whether that's, you know, waking up at a certain time, or making sure that you're taking time to eat, you know, like eating your 3 meals a day, or having time off of the computer, or time outside, you know, identifying 3 or 4 things that are specific to you that help you from a coping perspective. And making sure that you have those things ideally every day, but even if not every day, like let's say you really need to be outside and we've had crazy weather, you know, in the evenings the last few days, and maybe that's the only time you have available to get outside. Okay, so what's your backup? Is it listening to music? Is it reading a book for fun? Is it taking a bubble bath? Is it standing in the shower alone for 10 minutes just because then nobody can access you? Like, whatever it may be, making sure that you have those things in place. I think it's also good to give yourself realistic goals for the week. And by that, I mean, it's easy to say, oh, I have all these hours, and, you know, I'm through working at 4. I could get so much done between 4 o'clock and bedtime. Okay, but maybe more realistic, because if it's hard to get those things done because everybody is still in your house, and the reality is we're exhausted by the end of the day. It is much more exhausting, in my opinion, to do your whole workday virtually than it is to do it in person. I don't know why it is, but it is. So, you know, giving yourself the grace of, okay, I have 2 things that I need to get accomplished this week that are separate from my work responsibilities or my school responsibilities. And maybe one of those is, hey, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to spend time with my kid or with my spouse, or, you know, not on the computer or not on the phone, or I'm going to clean off the one corner of the kitchen table. And if that's the only thing I get done this week, so be it. Or maybe this is the week I'm going to the grocery store and that's going to be my thing. So having those realistic expectations that 1 or 2 things is doable. If we put 1,000 things on our list and then we're not getting them done, when we're anxious and when we're stressed, it's easy to internalize that as a failure on our part somehow and to beat ourselves up for that. And the reality is, like, we're all very much in survival mode. And there will be some days that you will wake up and you feel like you can accomplish everything. And there will be days that you wake up and you're like, I don't feel it today. Like, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of these walls. I'm tired of looking at everything. Well, you know what? Maybe that's a day that you take a nap and you read a fun book and you give yourself the grace and the wiggle room to do that. We have to give ourselves that balance. Now, if you're doing that every single day and your work responsibilities are falling off or your home responsibilities are falling off, then that's when we worry about, okay, is this now turning into something else? Now are we seeing some depression developing or some anxiety developing? But I would say start with those 4 or 5 things that you need every day that just help you feel more like you, and then add in 1 or 2 things a week that are your goal. And if you're constantly hitting those out and 1 or 2 seems easy, add in 3, but don't make your list 45 things that you're going to get accomplished that week.
That was very helpful. Thank you. The next question is from Ms. Caroline Brooks. I invite you to ask your question.
Thank you. I was wondering how students can deal with the tension that they might be feeling of wanting to remain cautious with family members or friends who might seem to be in a rush to re-enter society as usual.
Yes, this is a huge issue, especially now as things are starting to open up. And I think the comment that I made to my husband, we're very much still sheltering in place and not going anywhere, not seeing anybody. And that is not necessarily the attitude of people that we love. And I feel a little bit like it's like zombies, like coming at our doors and our windows trying to get to us. So it's finding what's comfortable. So if you're somebody who isn't ready yet to be out there, know that about yourself and recognize that that is an okay place to be. And if there's somebody else who was pretty much like, hey, the minute that we're allowed to go out places, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do everything. That's where they are. And their choice does not belittle your choice. And your choice does not belittle their choice. Like, we have to kind of give everybody grace about our choices. But then what is the happy medium? Okay, so hey, maybe I'd really like to see you. I'm not comfortable meeting you in public. But hey, if you want to come over and sit on one side of my driveway and I'll sit on the other and we agree to be in our own chairs and we can talk, great. If that doesn't feel comfortable, hey, maybe we can do a Zoom thing, or maybe you can FaceTime me while you're out for a walk, or if you're meeting people somewhere, FaceTime me and I'll join in that way. Or come and we'll talk through the window, whatever your comfort level is. Because if you are not comfortable and you're going because you feel like you should, the interaction is not going to be a good one anyway, because your anxiety is so high. And it is really hard because not everybody is going to respect that decision. Or it's easy to feel like I'm missing out on something because I'm going out there. I'm not ready to go out there. But it's being able to find that balance. And then once you've made the decision, if you've made the decision that you're not going to go, then you have to just hang on to that as just, this is where I am this week. And it could change next week. I might feel differently next week, and that's okay. And just being really honest with the people in your life about where you are with it.
All right. The next question comes from us from Ms. Sylvia Ruiz Martinez.
Hi, yes, my question was, well, we've been teaching distance learning. Some students have mentioned that they're having a hard time learning from home with all the different distractions that they may encounter at home. Not knowing how the next school year will start, what can they do now in order to get ready and prepare themselves for the unknowns of the next school year?
Yeah, that is a great question. For all of us, the learning curve on this from an education perspective has been very steep, where we were teaching and learning in one model, and then literally overnight it changed. And so teachers were having to completely revamp, and students were completely trying to revamp. I think we have also learned a lot from that about what works and what we may need to tweak. So what I would encourage, if there are students who know that they're having these were things that did not work for me at the end of the semester, I would encourage reaching out to either a teacher from this year that there's a good relationship with, or if they know who their teachers will be for next year, and say, here are some of the issues here's where I struggled. Here's what worked well for me, and here's what didn't. And see if there's problem solving that they can do with the teacher in advance. It also, from a family perspective, because this happened so rapidly, families were also in a position of scrambling, where you have a parent or two who are suddenly working full-time jobs from home while also trying to support the educational needs of their children. And sometimes with one device for everybody, and everybody's got Zoom calls and meetings and all of this. So it may also be worth a meeting with the family, or like the family having a conversation about what worked and what didn't, and what do we need to think about differently. Whether that's, okay, I have my classroom meetings at this time. That's how it was this year. This is what got in the way. Okay, so can we as a family identify a spot where there might be fewer distractions while you're on that? Or do we need to get in as much information as we can ahead of time to have the right materials, or to have things lined up ahead of time? Or there, how do we work that as a family, and start problem solving that now? And I would almost encourage, there's so much that we don't know about the fall, and there's so many different possibilities of what we're dealing with. My bias is, let's prepare for the worst case, because then we can always go backwards. So if we prepare for, what if we are doing this from the get-go? What if we are starting the school year with distance learning from the very beginning with parents home? What do we need to put in place as a family to make that work? What do I need to communicate with my teacher to figure out how to make that work? Because then if that's not our situation, great. But then we already have a plan in place to try to minimize as much of that difficulty as we can.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, the next question comes from Ms. Tiffany Jenkins.
Hi, I was just wondering if you had any advice or strategies for success for students who now are helping out with their younger siblings at home, either with schoolwork or just helping out with their younger siblings and helping with the family ability.
Okay, I think I got most of that. It was kind of hard to hear you, but so students who are helping out with younger siblings at home in terms of schooling, but also, was there something in addition to schooling?
Just also with like how to cope with like, the new way of life now.
Okay. So yeah, that's a great question too. So I think depending on the age of the younger siblings, from an educational perspective, you sort of have to take younger kids when they're home. You have to sort of strike while the iron is hot. So it may be, okay, like after breakfast, we're going to knock out 2 or 3 things quickly, or maybe it's only one thing. We're going to knock this thing out, and then we're going to take a break, and we're going to run around, and then we're going to, come back and try to do something else. I think for younger kids, at our house, and mine are really pretty little. My oldest one is only 6, but we have not talked a whole lot about what may come. We've done a little bit of that. My kids know that there's this germ, and that's why we're not going to school, and it's why everywhere that we would normally go is not available to us. And we have talked a little bit about fall, in that sorry, one of them's yelling in the background. It may look like this. It may be that you're going to school every day. It may be that you're home and doing some school with us. We have to kind of plan a little bit for each scenario. But I think for kids, the littler ones, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of creativity to engage them in a way that keeps their attention. I have also discovered, I feel like, at least for mine, about 20 to 25 minutes into a Zoom call and they're done. That's about all that they can handle. And finding that balance of, okay, it's okay for us to get off and we can, we'll go and extend this learning in a different way if we can't sit there the whole time. I feel like I only got part of your question. Did that get it? Okay, good. As you're driving. Okay.
Okay, the next question is from Kevin Garcia.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
So my question was, so there are a lot of students whose parents are essential workers, and with that comes a lot of anxiety because there's a lot of uncertainty. Like when their parents leave their home, they don't know what could happen or if they would come back. And like this is more like a question for like the older kids who understand the situation. It's like I know like my little sister, like she like doesn't really understand how like serious it could be. There are like the older kids do fear sometimes for their parents' safety.
So that is a great question. And I think that's something that a lot of people are dealing with. And this is where I feel like the news and the media and social media can really fuel a lot of that anxiety, and because there's a lot that we don't know, and a lot of times things are getting reported before we really have a whole lot of information. So my recommendation is knowing that your parents are going and are essential workers, and also knowing that they are doing their part as much as they can to keep themselves safe, whether that's wearing masks or washing hands frequently or changing their clothes when they get home or whatever the stipulations are in place, and having some faith and some hope in those systems, knowing that there is certainly the possibility that people will get this and will get sick, but also focusing on what we do know, which is the vast majority of people who get this end up fine. There are cases where that is not what happens and they do get very sick, but the vast majority of people are fine. And so sometimes what happens with anxiety is we get sort of stuck in our head in what I call sort of the what if tornado, right? So it's, well, what if, my mom goes, and what if she gets sick? And what if she comes home? And what if she gives it to me? And what if I give it to my sister? And what if, I don't know, and I go to school, and what if it gets really bad? And what if somebody has to go to the hospital, and so on and so on and so forth. And the reality is there's no way for us to know how this will impact any of us when and if we get it. But if that is happening, if that cycle is happening, and you can mentally say to yourself, okay, stop, like these are worry thoughts, and it's normal to have them. It's totally expected to have them, but they just are increasing my anxiety. And so instead, if I can rephrase this, like, okay, well, what if mom goes to work? Okay, well, I know that she's washing her hands, and I know that she's wearing her mask, and I know that she's being really careful, and I know that I'm doing my part to be helpful, and I'm washing my hands, and I'm being careful, and I know that they've put these limits in place on various places in an effort to keep everybody safe. And I know that, we're going to find a way to come through this, whatever it may be. Giving yourself, sort of reframing those what if thoughts. So when you have that what if worry thought, figuring out, how do I rephrase that? How do I turn that from a more harmful and anxious feeding thought into a more neutral thought? And most of us cope with anxiety by trying to take control over the situation, right? Like that's the best way to deal with anxiety. And here we are in a situation that we have no control over. And that's part of what is so unsettling about it. So look at, what can you control? Okay, well, you can control that, your mom or your dad is doing exactly what they need to be doing. And that, I can help by helping take care of my sister, or I can help by doing whatever, and focus on what you can do. And then just, it comes down to just sort of having trust and hope and faith that the rest of the pieces will fall into place. But that is very difficult. And when you feel that anxiety being really high, if you feel like you can't counteract those what if thoughts, even just stopping and doing 10 really big deep breaths and kind of focusing your attention on something else can help bring that anxiety down enough that then you can start to counteract some of those thoughts. You're welcome.
That's great. Okay, the next question is from Maya. So I invite you to ask your question.
How has COVID-19 affected you with your job, such as how your patients feel about it and how you've tried to help them out?
That is a great question. So everything has essentially shifted to a telehealth model. It's interesting. So psychologists fall into the essential workers category. So for a lot of my colleagues who work in a hospital setting, for example, they have still been reporting into the hospitals, but the work that they're doing, rather than going up onto the hospital floors and meeting with patients, which is what we would typically be doing, is happening more like this. So I'm in my office and I'm calling up to the floor, or I'm having that conversation with a patient or a client over the computer. It's not ideal. It's doable. It's always better to be able to be in the same room with somebody and to really be able to see their facial expressions and be present with them, especially with high emotion. It's just nice to know that there's somebody in the room with you when that's happening. But it's much better, in my opinion, than just being on the phone, because you can see some of those social interactions. For some of my patients who have a lot of anxiety, it's helpful to them not to have the question of whether or not they have to go out and come into a building and sit somewhere. At the same time, a lot of what we do with anxiety is what we call desensitization, which is when there are things that make us anxious that we would avoid. As psychologists, we encourage addressing some of those things in order to help build up your coping strategies. Pandemics are a slightly different beast in that regard. But if you're so nervous about leaving the house, having to go to an appointment can actually be a really good way to learn how to cope with that. Like, okay, I'm going to get in the car and I'm going to put my mask on and I'm going to go directly into this office and I'm going to sit there and I'm only interacting with my doctor and then I'm leaving. The other part of it that has evolved quite a bit is, so my primary role has always been kids and teenagers. Kids and teenagers come with parents. It comes with the trade. So I do a lot with parents anyway, but it tends to be more family oriented. And now what's happening is we have a lot of parents who are also very stressed and very anxious. And so my focus has expanded essentially into supporting the child and the adolescent, but also supporting the parent with their own concerns and anxiety and stress. So it's a great field. There's always job security, so something to think about. But it's expanded quite a bit over this.
Okay, the next question comes from Minerva Palacios.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering what could be a potential action for supporting elderly family members who have like the media and watching news negatively changing their mindset.
Like increasing their anxiety, you mean, or making them feel like they should go out and see everybody?
Like anxiety and like worrying about things in the world.
So if you have an elderly relative who you have access to, like who is living with you, as an example, what we have done is we have real limit. Well, so my kids are not on screens, but for me and my husband, we have given ourselves basically limits on how much stuff we will look up, like how much news we will watch, or if we will watch the news. Similar kinds of limits, if they're enforceable for elderly relatives, can be helpful, or directing them towards reputable sources. So, like the San Antonio mayor's office has a website that shows the indicators and things that they're looking at. That can be helpful if you have a relative who's looking for information, but you want to make sure it's valid information. And then the other piece of it too is if you have an elderly relative who's not with you, so you're not able to sit with them, they're not in your house. And so your ability to interact with them is limited. You can give them alternatives. So instead of watching the news, hey, like, why don't you watch this show and I'm going to watch it too. And then let's call and talk to each other about it. Or let's read this book together and talk about it, and give them an alternative thing to occupy their time that's not going to create as much anxiety, because it is overwhelming, and not knowing what's accurate or valid and what's not can be hard to piece out, even for us, and for somebody who's elderly, and it may be even more confusing. It's a lot to take in.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, the next question comes from Kaylee Casares.
Okay, hi. So I was wondering, what would be some psychological imprints that not only students but elderly people will have in the future when something like this emerges again?
So I'm so sorry. I was getting a lot of feedback and couldn't get the question. Can you repeat it for me?
Okay. So what would be some psychological imprints that not only students but elderly people will have in the future when something like this emerges again?
So we're still having problems hearing you, Kaylee, but the question is, what would be some psychological imprints that not only students but elderly people will have in the future when something like this comes around again?
So to a certain extent, this is creating trauma for all of us, right? So it's unexpected. It has completely switched how we look at social interaction and how we look at the world. So what we anticipate will happen is that when this is behind us and we're starting to roll back out, we will see higher levels of anxiety and potentially higher levels of concern about germs and hand washing. Some of that is good, right? Like, we would want to be washing our hands more. We want to be cautious of germs, but there's this fine line between, are we protecting ourselves, and at what point does it cross over and become a symptom of anxiety? Or when does it potentially become something that we are obsessing about or that we're compulsive about? Similarly, because we've all had to do this social distancing for so long, and we're such social people, and the human race thrives on social interaction, there's sort of, what are our social relationships going to look like when this is over? Like, how, unless they come out and do this broad announcement, you may now hug your relatives, there's this sort of fear of, well, if I hug you, am I going to hurt you? And so part of that is going to be mediated by us having information about, okay, now we have a vaccine, or now we know that these are things that are safe to do. The reality is, a lot of it will come from us having that exposure. So we've adapted relatively quickly to this new lifestyle, as uncomfortable as it is. Once we're allowed back out, there will be hesitation and anxiety associated with that. At the same time, as we are forced to continue to go to school, or forced to come into the office, or forced to do those things, some of that anxiety will come down, because we will have that experience of, we're interacting with people and it's okay. But that is something that psychologists as a whole are talking about. We are expecting that at the end of this, we will have higher levels of anxiety that need to be addressed. We will have higher levels of concern. We will have some families that continue to hoard toilet paper or wipe down their groceries. And some of that, if that is what you're left with, and you're functioning okay other than that, like, okay, if it's not a problem for you, then it's not a problem. But we want to help people get back to normal, but it will take some support and some skills along the way to help counteract that anxiety that's developed while we're all in this situation. That's a great question.
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you, Kaylee and Dr. Mauzé. The next question is from Jennifer Salazar. So now I invite you to ask your questions.
Thank you. My question is, you've talked about established patients and how the interaction is now has shifted to an online setting. And we've also addressed the changes that we might expect in the future. But do you have any recommendations that you would have for potential new patients, like patients that recognize right now that had not previously needed help with anxiety, and now with impacts from work and school and their daily home life, that now need help right now to find a doctor? What recommendations would you have to find support or find a doctor in these circumstances that we're in, unable to really go out there and look for a doctor?
That is a great question. Thank you for that. Yes. So the vast majority of mental health professionals are taking on new patients. So the biggest trick is, so the insurance companies were approving telehealth for the first month. And then there's some debate as to whether or not they're still going to cover it. That being said, a psychologist will see you. I mean, whether or not the insurance will cover it, the psychologists typically are going to be able to see you. But what I would recommend, so if you have somebody who is in need of care right now, the best things to do are to first reach out to either your primary care physician, or if it's in regard to a child or a teenager, reach out to the pediatrician. They have lists of names typically of psychologists, social workers, counselors in the area. And as I said, the vast majority of us are still doing telehealth. There are some who are in office, but that's something that they can very easily work out. I almost think, my bias is, it's almost easier to start with a new patient right now in telehealth than with one that you're used to seeing in person, because it's such a shift. But when you're starting with somebody new, it works out well. You can also reach out to your insurance company to find out who within your insurance is covered. Some practitioners in private practice don't take insurance, but will bill you through your out-of-network benefit, and you can get reimbursed. But it's worth looking into that ahead of time. And if you call your insurance company, they will send you a list of counselors, typically ones who are taking new patients. And then there's a little bit of calling. Another really good resource is psychologytoday.com. So that's one phrase, psychologytoday.com. And you can search based on zip code. You can search based on presenting issue. So anxiety, depression, teen, adult, female, male, you can look at all of those things. They give you little bios of everybody. That's how I would start. And then you can identify who might be a good fit. And a lot of people, especially right now, will do like a free 15-minute consultation on the phone. So you can get a sense of personality and know, does this person feel like they would fit me? Yes. Okay. And then you can schedule from there. And then they do it through their own telehealth system, which is confidential and protected and all of those things. I also actually too, on the slides that I gave to Eddie that he's going to post, at the very last slide has 3 phone numbers, or maybe 4 phone numbers of local and national resources that you can also call to get connected.
So thank you, Dr. Mauzé. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for joining us today. Are there any closing remarks that you would like to share with us?
I'm just grateful to you all for having me. I really appreciate it. I know there were a lot of really good questions, and it's an important topic. So I would just encourage you all to keep talking to each other. And if I can be helpful in any way moving forward, don't hesitate to reach out to Eddie, and he can connect with me, and I'm happy to help however I can.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. So this concludes our CAST Live event. Stay tuned for our next event, which will be June 12th, Friday, another question and answer session with a student from CAST, which will be moderated by a rising freshman, Maya Pacheco, who will be a part of the inaugural class of CAST Lead. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend.